This event tonight has been in the works for a while, and I'm very pleased to have this particular panel because we have both a political science professor, a working journalist, and also a legal scholar who all bring different perspectives on this very timely issue. As you know, this new state secrecy law has all sorts of implications, and given what we've seen in recent years, you know, with the Fukushima nuclear crisis, for instance, I wonder what we would know about that accident if this law had been in place at that time. And when we look forward to the possible implications, it's something that I think we all find worrisome. The scholars, or the participants for this panel, Martin Fackler, Koichi Nakano, and Larry Repeta, have considerable experience in Japan and have been working on issues related to this in one way or the other for many years. Martin Fackler is the Tokyo bureau chief of the New York Times. He's been here for over 20 years, was a graduate of Keio University, has a master's in journalism, and in addition to working for the New York Times, has published widely in the Wall Street Journal, the Far East Economic Review, the Associated Press, and others. Martin and his colleagues were shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize for their work on the Fukushima nuclear crisis. And as a working journalist, I'm sure that he has much to say on this issue. He's the author also of a book about the way the Japanese press covered the Fukushima crisis called Credibility Lost, the Crisis in Japanese Newspaper Journalism After Fukushima, which I think, Martin, is that only available in Japanese? Also, we have with us Koichi Nakano, who's a professor of political science at the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Sophia University. He specializes in comparative politics, particularly Japan and also political theory. Graduate at the University of Tokyo, he also has a PhD in politics from Princeton University and has done considerable work on contemporary political issues related to nationalism. He is the author of a book called When the Opposition Governs in 2010, and more recently, a book in Japanese on post-war state conservatism in Japan. Also, he is a very frequent commentator on the media, everything from the BBC to CNN, Le Monde, Reuters, etc. Larry Repeta, who happens to be the former law director of TUJ, along with Vicki Myers, who's in front, also a former law director of TUJ. Larry has been a lawyer, business executive, and a law professor in Japan. Larry is well known in the legal community in Japan for bringing a case to the Japanese Supreme Court in 1989 that now allows, as a result of this case, note-taking to be taken in public courtroom. He is a professor at Meiji University and is the author of Limiting Fundamental Rights Protection in Japan, the Role of the Supreme Court. And we'll open the event tonight by talking about these issues. So I could turn to Larry.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Kyle. Before I get started, and before I forget, I want to mention that for people who are interested in these issues, you might mark your calendar because next month, Mr. Morton Halperin will be in Tokyo, and he will make a presentation on Saturday, May 10th, starting at 5 p.m. At the building of the National Bar Association, the Japan Federation of Bar Associations, the Meiji premise. They can't hear me. Is this better? This is not better. Well, it was working well. Okay, so anyway, for any of you who are interested in these issues, Saturday, May 10th, there'll be a presentation at the National Bar Association in Kasumigaseki. Mr. Halperin has served in senior positions in several administrations, starting, I think, with the Nixon administration, in positions where he participated in deciding policy related to handling of national security secrets. So it's a great opportunity to listen to a real expert discuss some of the issues that we have arising when we think about secrecy law, and in particular secrecy law that's related to national security. And of course the fundamental problem that we're looking at is to think about balance. If we have a democratic government, of course the foundation is the people are sovereign, the people have a right to know about what their government is doing and why the government is taking that action, and people have a right of access to information in government hands. The government works for us. On one hand. On the other hand, I think most of us, maybe all of us, would recognize that there's some kinds of information that should be kept secret, particularly related to national security and military affairs and so on. And so coming up with a balance to decide in what cases information should be kept secret and which cases should not is a very, very difficult problem. So that's what we'll be talking about this evening. If we move to the next slide, we can think about just briefly the sort of what happened in Japan last year. In this short list of events, I've started with the election in July. And as I'm sure most of you know, Prime Minister Abe took office in December of 2012 when the LDP won a big victory in the lower house election. And then in July of last year, we had the upper house election, and it was another big victory. So at that point, the ruling coalition had enough power to really pass any kind of law it wanted. And Professor Nakano, I think, will be talking about some of those political issues. Very, very soon thereafter, September 3rd, so you think in August, not much happens in Japan. The very beginning of September, the LDP government, the Abe administration, releases a summary of their planned secrecy law and solicits public comment. The public comment period is 2 weeks. According to the government, there were 86,000 comments received. The vast majority were opposed to this proposal. Nonetheless, the process moves forward. The bill was submitted to the lower house in late October. It was passed the next day, October 26th. There were some changes we might talk about later. Then it moved to October 25th, the bill was submitted to the lower house. A month later, November 25th, the bill was presented. It was revised. The revised bill was presented, and it was passed by the lower house the next day. It moved to the upper house. It passed the upper house on December 6th, and thereby the bill becomes a law. So it came into law on December 6th of last year. There was wide-ranging opposition from the very beginning. Some of you may remember, I started here with September, as we noted, the summary, not the full bill, but a summary was released and public comment was sought. And so immediately we get response from, for example, the National Bar Association, a formal declaration in opposition. We get a declaration from the Japan Civil Liberties Union along the same lines. We get another declaration by constitutional law professors. It was released under the names of 24 leaders. They use the word yobikakenin, I think, or sewanin. 24 famous leading Japanese constitutional scholars announced their opposition. That statement was subsequently signed by many, many others. Same thing with regard to criminal law professors and other citizens groups. So there were many formal declarations in opposition. As anyone who is in Tokyo knows, there were mass street demonstrations as well. And of course, news media organizations opposed it. And what I'll talk about a little bit this evening is on November 19th, we actually got a formal letter from the United Nations, special rapporteurs, they're called. So the special rapporteurs are experts in the field who are appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council to track these issues worldwide. And so on November 19th, a letter was delivered to the Japanese government under the signature of two of the special rapporteurs, one named Frank LaRue, who's an expert in freedom of expression, and the other, Anand Grover, whose name you may know, because I think his area is public health and safety, and he's released some statements related to the Fukushima incident. So this is just a screenshot of the letter sent to the Japanese government, November 19th. Next, please. This is a screenshot of a document dated January 31 This was the Japanese government's response. So on November 19, I thought this was quite interesting. So there was a lot of opposition to this bill. But in addition to local Japanese domestic opposition, we have United Nations experts who also weigh in. And as you may know, Japan is a signatory to many human rights treaties. And Japan, like other signatories of those treaties, is subject to review. So for example, July of this year in Geneva, the United Nations Human Rights Commission will review Japan's report under a major international human rights treaty. Many Japanese groups, like the National Bar Association, have filed statements with the UN Human Rights Committee, and some will fly to Geneva to talk to the panel of perhaps about 15 experts who will review these issues. Anyway, my point is there's an international dialogue based on fundamental international principles which are found in human rights treaties and in the United Nations Charter itself. So, we got the letter from the UN Special Rapporteurs, which raises several issues. We'll look at those issues. The Japanese government files a formal response attempting to rebut those issues. The last, can we move back? I was just mentioning, so both the original letter and the rebuttal were submitted to the Human Rights Council of the UN in February. And you can find those documents online if you're interested. Next, please. The summary of the criticism is stated here. They wrote that, quote, grave concern is expressed that the proposed special secrets bill could severely restrict the right of freedom of opinion and expression in Japan. Grave concern is further expressed that this legislative development could curtail the activities of journalists and will certainly intimidate whistleblowers. So this statement from the UN experts really matches the message that was being delivered by all of the opponents in Japan, whether bar associations or law professors or other. I think this is the core of it, the fear that this bill could result in too much information being made secret, and if you ask, what is the single most prominent feature of that bill which changed the situation in Japan? It clearly is the threat of criminal punishment. So under this law that passed in December, any government official who is accused of improperly releasing a designated secret can be subject to imprisonment of up to 10 years. Prior to that, the pre-existing law in general would have been up to 1 year. So that was moved up to 10. A journalist or some other person who is accused of improperly persuading a government official to release secret information under this new law can potentially be charged with an imprisonment of up to 5 years. Previous law was 1. I think the major criticism against the bill is this threat to access to information and to the work of journalists and others who are trying to get the story out. The UN rapporteurs wrote, based on the information they've received, what are the problems? Number one, the definition of protected information is broad, unclear, vague. Number two, the second point concerns the period for which the information may be made secret. And so they say, as we understand this bill, it could be for a very, very long time. Number three, of course, you ask the question, well, who can decide? Who decides whether the information should be secret or not? And the law clearly states that the head of every major government agency, whether it is the Ministry of Defense, or whether it's the Ministry of Agriculture or another government agency, the head of each of the major agencies has the power to designate the information as secret, and they continue and say, with no references on the review by any independent body. the discussion of whether there can be an independent body to review these decisions became a key part of the debate in Japan. Finally, they say, when we get to penalties, may seriously threaten whistleblowers and journalists, he said. So this concerns the fear that whistleblowers, journalists, researchers, others may be charged with improperly gaining information from some government official or another person who has secrets. Next. Next, please. So, the UN finished its question with, finished its letter with these questions. Are these facts we just said accurate or not? Please provide full details of the bill and explain its provisions. And of course, many people have asked me, said, well, do we have an English translation of this law? And in its message in January, the government of Japan told the UN that, sorry, we don't have an English translation. And any of you who worked on difficult translations know how difficult it could be. Number 3, please indicate the main legal and institutional instruments in place to ensure the realization of the right of access to information in Japan. So the letter from the UN says, of course, among fundamental rights is the right of people to have access to information. And yes, you may have a secrecy law, but do you also have law that guarantees good access to information? So they ask about that. Finally, number 4, this is another difficult issue in Japan. So they asked, well, as you were developing this bill, what kind of dialogue did you have with civil society representatives? How were the people represented from outside the government? Whether it's NGOs or other civil organizations, how did they participate in this dialogue? There's just some selected provisions in the law, so I'd rather not go there. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Those are the questions that were raised by the UN specialists, and they're really the very same questions that were raised by other opponents of the law. And so the law's passed. And I think we'll get some other viewpoints from the other speakers as to what the significance is and what the political process is behind these laws and what we can expect in the future. And in my own case, when I think about a law like this, I try to think about how does it fit with some bigger agenda. And I've spoken here before about Mr. Abe and the LDP's plans to revise the Constitution. And this law fits very nicely with the plans to revise the Constitution, to give the government greater power, to reduce individual rights protection, to give the government greater freedom to exercise military power. Of course, expanded secrecy authority with the government will fit with that broader agenda very nicely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I stand up? I don't know if that's okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kyle, who's right in front of me, for inviting me. I appreciate that. And to the folks at Temple, and I hope that's not an omen here. I apologize for being in blue jeans and hiking boots. I just jumped off of Shinkansen, and I used that time on the train to prepare what I'm going to say. So if it sounds kind of hasty and I sound like I'm in a hurry, it's because I rushed here from Fukushima to get here to see you tonight. I also must apologize because I'm not a legal expert. I in many ways feel unqualified to talk about these things. But I think that Kyle asked me to come tonight because I am a working journalist and I really face this environment and the questions raised by this new law I will be facing. I don't think it's in effect yet, right? I think it goes into effect in a few months or something, but and I will be facing that, I guess, on a daily basis. And so what I want to do is just give some of my unexpert impressions, sources of concern, what worries me about the law, what I see potentially coming my way, and things of that nature. As Larry said, I haven't seen the law in English. I have a copy of the Japanese version. But for tonight, I'm going to rely on something provided by the Naikakufu, it's called the Cabinet Office, I guess. They gave journalists this nice little 5-page English language cheat sheet on the law. They gave us a special briefing because there was so much criticism of the law. They called us into the Naikakufu, the Cabinet offices, and discuss this in some detail, so I'll share with you tonight some of the things they told us. But I think, basically, my overall impression of the law is that I see some real dangers. And so I think it's important for us to scrutinize it, to be aware of what it says, and to really watch it, because I think as Larry was saying, it really kind of cuts to the core of the public's right to know, the public's ability to know, and then of course that gets to the issue of whether a public can debate issues of policy, how healthy can a civil society be, how healthy can a democracy be. I also want to say, just off the top, that I'm not trying to say that Japan's bad and America's good or anything like that. I certainly have plenty of problems with what's happening in the US as well. As Mr. Snowden has showed us, we have plenty of problems on the other side of the Pacific. But I will focus tonight on this side. So basically, I think I see, to summarize in the beginning, really 3 problems, right? Larry mentioned the question of the penalties, and he mentioned some of the other sort of problems. But the problems I see, first off, one, it seems to me the law is way too vague. It's just the way it's phrased when you read it. It just invites abuse. The second problem is that it empowers the bureaucracy, I think, to basically decide what's a secret, what's not a secret. And I don't see a whole lot of real check and balance from our elected representatives in the Diet. And the third problem is the drafters of the law, the Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office and the Cabinet Office. When they explain to us the various protections and limitations in the law, the problem is that most of those protections and limitations weren't actually in the law. And so it's basically just a verbal promise, and you get some of Hashimoto in an office, and that's all out the window, right? I mean, it's what guarantee is it, right? But those are my 3 main problems. So the first problem, let me go into each one in a little bit more detail, keeping an eye on the time. The first one is with this question of what is a secret, right? Specially designated secrets, right, is the name of the law. And on our little cheat sheet, they give us 4 categories: defense, prevention of terrorism, foreign affairs, and designated harmful activities. Okay, defense, okay, fine. You don't want to give out the specs of your hardware, fine. Prevention of terrorism, okay, I can go along with that one, I guess. Those 2 are relatively easy. When you get to foreign affairs, though, then the red flags start popping up, right? Because first off, foreign affairs is foreign policy. Policy is what we all need to debate in a democracy. People need to know what the policy is. So to declare foreign affairs as potentially off limits is a pretty broad area. And then they have a list of what that means in this little crib sheet that they gave us. And things that could be specially designated secrets include policy pertaining to the protection of lives and bodies of people, territorial integrity, and other issues deemed important to national security. That's pretty broad. I mean, and who gets to decide that? Well, Larry mentioned that, and I'll get into that issue in a second, but that's pretty flexible. The next one says that it can include things related to embargoes on imports or exports that Japan carries out for national security purposes or thereto relevant policies. And if you read the Japanese version of that, it sounds to me like I could be thrown in jail for writing about TPP. We're talking about trade here. Trade is now off limits. The last one in this long list of foreign affairs related misdeeds is the use of communications between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Japanese diplomatic establishments. Now, some of you may remember that there's a fellow, Private Manning, I think his name was, who dumped a bunch of State Department cables onto WikiLeaks, and we had access to those in our Washington bureau. And many of us wrote stories based on those cables. These are internal cables between the State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Japan, for example. I mean, and this sounds like if, for example, I were to get my hands on the Japanese equivalent of that, I could be thrown in prison. So I guess perhaps the U.S. law has the same vagueness, but still, it is worrisome. And then this other category now of designated harmful activities. I mean, you look at this, important information collected on the protection of lives and bodies of people, and the collection and organization of information listed in that section. So, I mean, does this include SPEEDY? I mean, does this include, and for those who don't remember SPEEDY, SPEEDY was this computer system that was supposed to predict where the radiation plumes after a nuclear accident would go. And it was not released until a month and a half after the accident or something, so it was completely useless since it was supposed to predict where the plumes would go so people could be evacuated before the plumes reached there. But the point being that if somebody were to get their hands on that SPEEDY information, which was later on became a very important issue in public debate in Japan about the government's handling of the accident, right? There are some very important issues. Would the possession of that SPEEDY information be considered a designated harmful activity? I mean, I can't tell because it's so vague, but that's exactly my problem with it, because then if it's so vague, then you can basically use it as a cudgel against whoever you want to use it. The other thing is who can be prosecuted. If you look on this cheat sheet, it has a list of all of the people who can be prosecuted. The people who disclose information, who have the information, and the people who receive the information, right? So if you are somebody who has a specially designated secret, like a government official, right? And you disclose that information, you can go to prison for 10 years, and if you receive that information, you can go to prison for 5 years. In fact, you can also go to prison if you attempt to instigate or incite the intentional leakage of that information. So in other words, if I call up some guy at some ministry somewhere and say, hey, what's the scoop on TPP? Do I go to prison? Am I inciting him to give away a state secret? Then the question of who gets to declare, what is a secret, right? In that briefing at the Cabinet Office, they told us that there were about 60 people, 60 people, who, under the currently would be allowed to declare secrets. And these include the ministers, the daijin, right, the ministers of the various ministries, the vice ministers, special advisors to the prime minister, chief cabinet secretary, deputy chief cabinet secretary, and people like that. And most of those, as you can recognize, are going to be politicians or political appointees. However, I still worry about this essentially becoming a sort of bonanza for the bureaucracy to increase its discretionary power, because if you look at past precedent, in most cases, the ministers don't exert a whole lot of control over what's the policy, right? Usually it's kind of just presented to them by the people, the bureaucrats who work for them, and they basically just regurgitate at the diet. So I'm a bit worried that this becomes the same pattern, that we essentially see it becomes essentially the Cabinet Office, the bureaucrats in the Cabinet Office have written all sorts of great new powers for the bureaucracy. When we raised these issues to the Cabinet Office, they said, no, we have two different check mechanisms. One is what they call the Council of Experts, which they said is a bunch of scholars who will come and check it. That just sounds like a shunikai, the classic sort of academic experts who come and rubber stamp whatever they're doing. So I don't see a lot of real reason to feel confidence in that one. The other one is the Committee for Protection and Oversight, which has a very promising name. But when you look at who runs it, it's basically the Jimujikan, the administrative vice ministers, the top bureaucrats of every ministry. So it's probably a great way for intra-agency coordination, but I don't see a whole lot of check and balance. And what I don't see, and maybe the experts, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see a clear role for the Diet. I don't see like the democratic processes, the people whom the Japanese people elect having much of a voice. And then the third problem I mentioned was the limitations that, the biggest limitation, if you look on page 26 of the law, is a provision that was added because the major newspaper is an NHK and these guys scream bloody murder, that says that Holdo, was that reporting, and Shuzai reporting, that makes sense. Holdo, the actual sort of broadcasting of your reporting, and Shuzai, the actual collection of information, that the freedom of these things should be fully considered. Okay. And the second part of it says that reporting Shuzai, the collection of information, will not be considered illegal unless it's done by illegal means or inappropriate means, which is just like crazy. Okay. So it's not illegal unless it's illegal. So someone want to explain that one to me. I don't. And then the part about it being inappropriate, right? Still in the whole inappropriate manner, right? And who declares something an inappropriate manner? I'll bet you money it's not a journalist. So I have some problems with that, but at least there is a protection. At least they did put a protection into the law. But there are two problems with that. One is that, how do you define a journalist? Right? I mean, does that include bloggers? Does that include think tanks? Does that include academics? I mean, can my friend Kyle over there go to prison? Well, I'm safe. Does that include foreign journalists? Do you have to be in the press club to be a journalist? And then the second thing is, what about sources? All right. So some guy tells me, oh yeah, there's this thing called Speedy, and they didn't release it, in March, and they only released it in May. And maybe I'm safe, but that guy goes to prison for 10 years. First off, ethically, this is wrong. I don't want to send someone to prison for 10 years. But second off, no one's ever going to talk, right? You're not going to have, everyone's going to clam up because they're afraid of going to the slammer for 10 years. Now, the last point is in these briefings that we had with the Cabinet Office, they assured us that this would not include whistleblowers, and one of the things they said is this would only prevent civil servants from leaking, not target journalists. I mean, for example, this protection of whistleblowers, I've looked through this thing. I don't see anything about whistleblowers. This thing being the law. I've looked, maybe I'm missing it. Please enlighten me if I am, but I don't see anything here that would tell me that a whistleblower is A, defined, and B, protected. So, again, this is many of the and they assured us this wasn't intended to be about policy debate, it wasn't intended to be about public debate, it wasn't intended to affect, the healthy functioning of democracy, et cetera, but most of that's just not in here, right? They have these two provisions about journalists, and otherwise it's just a long list of who gets in trouble and how bad they get in trouble. So I don't see a lot of these sort of assurances to me seem to be issues of interpretation or issues of how, kind of these verbal assurances. But again, someone else takes power and you can use these same letters to really very different purposes. I mean, letters mean the words, right, in the document. And so it seems like you've given somebody a very broad discretionary power really over something that's very central to the healthy functioning of a democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd rather prefer to see your faces. So, I'll be focusing more on the political side of the story, the political context of it. And what is of course interesting is, the strength or the scope of the opposition that really, mushroomed with the days that went by in late November and in December before the final passage of the law. And I can't, I'm a political scientist by profession, but I can't claim to be impartial to the episode because my own position as a Japanese citizen has been very clear from the outset when the bill was debated. And I didn't play a major role in any of those movements, but I was signatory to one of the petitions signed by over 2,000 academics who are not particularly legal experts, but I also was in front of the National Diet, both before the passage of the bill in the lower house and even the evening when they pushed that through in the upper house. So I don't claim to be objective or that sort of usual academic neutral stuff that I don't particularly believe in to begin with. You can tell perhaps. Anyway, the scope of the opposition was really quite significant. Those of you who have seen footages on YouTube, or some of you may have been there yourselves, it was really something that struck us as something like a replay of the height of anti-nuclear protest, in the summer, in the Noda government before the restart of the OE nuclear reactor. And you could also see that really people from all corners of life, people who are not professional activists were there. I saw high school students, I saw elderly, I saw mothers, and people came very concerned. And even though we knew the outcome of the political struggle, there were people in thousands, tens and thousands in front of the National Diet. And of course, you may also remember that the petition movements were spread in a way that was really quite unusual in the Japanese context. You had artists, you had authors, you had movie people, you had actors even speaking up. And I think Fujiwara Norika in particular, she talked about in her blog, and invited certain criticism because it's highly unusual, of course, for an actress like her to speak up on a political issue. And you put that in contrast with the government reassurance, and there's something quite odd about it, because I think Abe, in fact, is generally believing that he doesn't mean to do any harm. He doesn't seem to be very worried about, and he really doesn't seem to understand what the fuss is about. And the question is he right, and are we overly worried? Because the claim that this kind of law exists in any country, and the argument that Japan should do a better job of protecting state secrets is convincing to a degree. I mean, any state will have to have certain law protecting state secret of a sensitive kind, and it seems highly unrealistic to say that you don't need anything like that. And we all know the geopolitics of Northeast China at this juncture. So, so he would say, among other people who are in support of the law, that there's overreaction and there's nothing really to worry about. And so the question is how to understand that gap. And the way I see it, basically there's a combination of two things. And essentially, I regard the story of this state secrecy bill, which is now the law, as not something that was coming out of a political will. So it's not like scheming Abe was really thinking of taking civil liberties from us. And so it's the first step towards a grand plan of turning Japan into a North Korea. He doesn't have that grand vision, I don't think. In fact, the main story, it seems to be, is actually what Martin was talking about, a bureaucratic paradise. Japan is, of course, a country with a very strong bureaucracy, overbearing, overly secretive, and they treat politicians as guests, sometimes politely, sometimes not so politely, and it's sort of in that kind of line that is happening, because it's not a bill, as you may know, that was initiated by Abe from scratch. In fact, it was deliberated within the DPJ government as well. And in fact, even before the DPJ government came, Aso was really the last prime minister before they fell from power. In 2009, he was also considering that issue. And so it was in the pipeline for some time. And of course, a bill of this kind has been in the pipeline in different junctures in postal history of Japan, including the Cold War period. So, it's an old story in a way. And it's an old, it's an old bill that was desired by the bureaucrats, and with certain prodding at certain juncture coming from the US government perhaps, but it was in the pipeline. And the LDP, Abe happened to be there to enact the bill. So the part that I'm most immediately worried about is really this aspect of this law turning Japan into an even worse bureaucratic paradise. That's one thing. However, I don't think that's the only story either, because the problem has been compounded by the fact that it is actually Abe government who's enacting the bill. And what I mean by that is that the political context in which this is happening is not any time, any point in time, any random point in time in Japanese post-war history, but it happens to be at the present where the political system has never been this imbalanced. In other words, you have a super strong LDP in power, which is really the only game in town, with no opposition party to speak of, and very, very clearly unwilling to ever let power go. And so people dreamed about Japan turning into a two-party system, and the DPJ seizing power in 2009 seems to have realized that promise. Of course, that dream is now broken. DPJ is, has collapsed, and it's on its way out, perhaps. The other parties, which ones? The Law Party, which is really Watanabe Yoshimi's party, but now God knows whose party, but it's, it's just a satellite party of the LDP. And you can say even worse things about the Restoration Party, Ishinokai. These are the big parties that have been on the rise, even though they have lost some speed these days. So, really, we had one-party dominance in the past, in the so-called 1955 system. It's not even that, right? Because in the decades after the post-war, between 1955 and 1993 in particular, the LDP was always in power, and it was the perpetual governing party. But the Japanese political system always had, the left opposition, the socialists and the communists combined together, always held 30% of the seats in the Diet. So they never were able to seize power, but they presented sufficient check, and that moderated LDP government policies to a degree. Today we have none of that, right? And so that political context actually makes things worse, perhaps, and that's probably why people are perhaps reading too much into the law and exaggerating from the point of view of the policymakers. So people like Abe, who's born, of course, as a third-generation politician in a political dynasty, and who basically think of state power of a family asset, he genuinely believes that there's nothing to worry about because I'm a nice guy. I'm a nice guy, so why are you worried about it? And so would probably agree with that. Again, also as a third-generation politician, So you have that. However, I would also, give a bit more detail to what has already been presented. I think, in addition to the very elastic nature of the letters of the law, the scope of the secrets as defined by the law itself. When you consider the fact that, for example, that the secrets can be kept secret up to 60 years, that's horrifying, isn't it? So it's not like any other law, I don't think. Larry would be much more knowledgeable about this, but yes, state secrets laws of some kind exist in most countries, but it's not like just like any one of them, but it's severely lacking in balance in terms of having checks and balances and systems of ensuring that the sovereign people can retain their right to know is severely curtailed. And in fact, within the maximum 60 years period where the state can keep secrets, they can also destroy the secrets without getting punished. So in fact, some of the secrets can be held secrets eternally. So there's even exception to that maximum of 60 years. So I guess the idea that this is really, and there's also another very odd thing, I think, in the law. Within the 5 years of the implementation of this law, if the heads of the executive organs do not designate any secrets, they will lose, these agencies will lose power to designate secrets. Which is like a strange incentive for you to find something so that you can keep that power, right? Because if you're heading a bureaucracy, and we all know how bureaucracies behave, and we all know particularly how Japanese bureaucracies behave, perhaps. And in that context, then, if you want to maintain certain prestige, I think Ministry of Agriculture will find some state secret to designate so that it can hold on to this, to this prerogative or this authority. So we'll have to see, but of course we'll never really quite know which states, which are the designated secrets. So anyway, so having said this, I would also like to take a look at, in the remaining time that we have, of what are the arguments coming from, the other side. In other words, people who are in favor of this state secret. I took a look. Of course, the government ministers have been, responding to questions in diet not very well and all that sort of thing. But there is one legal professor that I respect who happens to be in favor of the law and who has made certain arguments public in the articles and also in the diet, actually, as a witness. Professor Hasebe Yasuo of Todai, formerly of Todai, today from April in Waseda. And the kind of arguments that he presents are, to me, really not very convincing, but I'll kind of just, introduce some of them to you here. So he argues that this is necessary to defend constitutional democracy of Japan. Japan has hostile neighbors, and they don't really show respect to democracy or the values of liberal democracies. And, it's all very nice and well to love democracy and freedoms, but if you don't have enough national security to protect them, then all will be lost. And therefore, this law is necessary. That's one argument he puts forward. He also argues that alternation in power would provide a check. That, it's impossible to have a third-party check in any real term, he argues, because the experts who can really know whether a secret should be designated as state secret is legitimately so or not, would only be, a possibility among very limited experts. So you can't really have amateurish third-party, lawmakers and whatnot to do the job. That's one argument he has. But instead, the fact that, the LDP may fall from power would, would encourage the LDP government or whichever party is in government to think twice before abusing power. That's one argument he has. He also argued that there would be a natural limits to the designation of secrets because the bureaucrats themselves will find it impossible to work if everything is designated as secret. So because it's like putting things in the safe, so you lock it and then designate the secret, and if you do so, then you need to, you basically make that piece of information available only for a limited number of people, and therefore, it won't be possible to expand too much the scope of the secret. That's another thing he says. He also said that certain ambiguity is inherent in all laws, that conventions and common sense shape their actual application. So this is not special. The fact that the law is vague here is not anything that is particularly unique or for the first time, but laws tend to be that way, he argues. And ultimately, basically, I think this sums up pretty much his main point, that it's up to the civil society to put a brake on the government abuses of the law. Right? I don't know whether you were swayed by his arguments. I'm not, but it's sort of to me, it's somewhat disturbing that somebody like Professor Hasebe can only come up with these very weak arguments, to be honest, because he's really not somebody who's authoritarian, or he's not anybody who's stupid, really. I mean, he's a top-ranked constitution expert, and usually quite liberal on many issues. But on this particular issue, he doesn't think that this is a problem, because it's up to the civil society to ensure that the government doesn't abuse its power. But I guess the reasons why people like me are very worried about this, because the Abe government precisely seems to have ignored completely the civil society opposition, even when the bill itself was enacted. And so the idea that there will be better listeners once the law is passed is very hard to agree. And I do have certain faith in the civil society of Japan. And I do think that there's going to be continuous groups of people who are going to be opposed and who try to ensure that the power is not abused. But I'm also a political scientist, and looking at the party system today, I have to say that there is a big gap between and this issue actually comes up in various different issues as well, and including the current government's attempt to revise the interpretation of the constitution to enable Japan to exercise its right of collective self-defense. The popular sentiment, the popular views are very strongly opposed. The government goes completely to the other direction, right? And you can say the same thing about the nuclear power as well. Public opinion continuously shows strong opposition to the resumption of nuclear power. The government seems to be very happy to ignore that as well. And so, and the question is why is that? I mean, how can they do that? And these events, I think, and this is really to do with the political context that makes this law even more worrisome, other than this being, a sort of a worsening the bureaucratic paradise, is really the fact that this is part of a larger whole, that Abe government has been embarked on a series of initiatives that basically together constitute sustained attacks on constitutionalism in Japan. The idea that the government of the day, even if democratically elected, should be kept in check by the constitution. So first, you might remember last year, I think it was around May or June, Abe toyed with the idea of revising Article 96 of the constitution, right? To make it easier to revise the constitution with only simple majority in both houses plus a referendum, as opposed to two-thirds majority in both houses. He then, of course, did this, and then, of course, today he's trying to revise the interpretation of the constitution to allow for the exercise of collective self-defense, which basically makes Article 9 completely meaningless, right? I mean, Article 9 has not been, implemented according to the strict letters perhaps already for quite some time, but it has served as a brake for some time about, from Japan doing even more, and collective self-defense was, of course, one issue that was made impossible, and even his own grandfather, Koichi, realized that according to the constitution, you can't just change the interpretation and allow for the country to exercise collective self-defense. Abe wants to overcome that hurdle. And of course, you think of NHK, the Bank of Japan, the Cabinet Legislation Bureaus, those organs that are supposed to be at least semi-independent from the state are increasingly emasculated and brought under the control. So you see those series of events, and quite obviously Abe doesn't like to be told to sort of modify his ambitions. At this point, you look at the Japanese political system, the only real break that seems to exist is actually outside of Japan in the form of the US government. And even that is not a perfect break, as you could see in his visit to the Yasukuni Shrine on December 26th last year. So we have a highly unbalanced system already, and this law is taking effect shortly. So this is, I think, why we need to be very vigilant, and this is why I think, looking at the political context, there are legitimate reasons why we need to be concerned about this. Thank you.
For the remainder of time, we'll have a Q&A. If I could ask if you could please stand up and identify yourself when you speak. Try to ask a question that's rather brief, given our limitations. And also, stay right on the mic because we are recording this. Please note that by speaking, you are providing consent for this to be published on our YouTube channel. So if that's a concern, then maybe you will speak.
Hello, my name is Johnson Portu. Thank you for your talk. It was very informative. So going on the basis of every general essentially wants more ammunition for his or her troops, I don't see much incentive for state actors or those within opposition, either within the LDP or outside of it, from actually changing the law or challenging the now status quo. So I'm wondering how salient this is to the median voter. And if it is salient, and if it remains to be salient, are there any other instances where unpopular laws have been changed or revised in the face of electoral threats?
Who would like to do that? Is that directed to a particular person?
Professor Nakano, you talked about civil society, so perhaps.
No, thank you for your question. Okay. Well, I can't think of the top of my head of a law that was revised because it was unpopular, to be honest, but maybe I need to think harder. But I mean, I have to say that it's highly unlikely that this is going to change because it's not a level playing field that we are talking about in electoral politics in Japan today. I mean, first, the bureaucracy is very, very powerful, has remained very powerful in Japan to begin with, right? And the bureaucrats were never happy with the DPJ in power. And so, you know, the kind of sabotage that they got engaged in when the DPJ was in power is very real. And of course, today they are doing everything they can to make Abe like a leader. They go out of their way to support him. So, you know, it's sort of a, you know, you scratch my back, I scratch yours kind of deal between the LDP and the bureaucracy. So the LDP is very well supported by, you know, by a third party already, as it were. And in addition to that, you need to also consider the fact that the electoral system that is in place today, the first past the post system being predominant in the lower house, and in the upper house too, actually, you know, the first past the post system exists in the rural constituencies. Over 20 of the prefectural constituencies are, you know, decided by the first past the post. You know, there's only one winner. It's a single-member district. And of course, in the rural areas, the LDP is very strong. So if you actually look at the level of support of the LDP, you know, only about 1 in 6 Japanese actively go vote to support the LDP. So, you know, if you include those people who abstain, you know, and then you actually look into the number of people who bothered to go to the polling booth and write the name of either the LDP or the LDP candidates, it's only about 16 to 18%. That was so in December 2012, and it was so again in July last year when they won the upper house. So they have a very highly rigged system where they can maximize the gain in seats with, you know, thanks to the electoral system, because the DPJ is no longer a viable opposition, and because the opposition parties got fragmented. You know, the first past the post system does its magic. You know, it turns the minority of votes into a big majority of seats, and it has been doing so in the past 2 elections tremendously in the advantage of the LDP. But you know, whether that's going to change, of course, you need to rebuild another alternative to the LDP with what? Hashimoto? Ishihara? Watanabe Yoshimi perhaps going to jail, I don't know. But you know, it's really not a very, you know, uplifting picture you have here. So, and the LDP people know that, right? And you have to remember also the fact that, you know, people like Aso, who was Prime Minister at the time, today back as Deputy Prime Minister, compared the DPJ to the Nazis when he was about to lose the election, right? You know, he said that, you know, the Germans once thought it was a good idea to give power to the Nazis. Look what happened to them. So vote for the LDP again. So it's with that sort of, you know, resentment and reluctance to accept the game of parliamentary democracy. You know, those people, hereditary politicians, who are born assuming that state power belonged to them and their families. I think it's very difficult to change that.
Hi, I work for an actual medical device manufacturer here in Japan, and you know, hearing about having to deal with the bureaucracy, I think a lot about what my company does. When we want to launch a new product or when we want to try something new, we deal a lot with the bureaucracy. Actually, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, the MHLW, and it's funny thinking about how a whole new group of people are going to have to start dealing with the bureaucracy in a whole new way, right? But for us, it's my impression that we have a very good relationship with MHLW. We consult with them on various things. I mean, I'm not in that department, it's not my area of expertise, but it certainly seems like there's a very good two-way communication and a kind of open door, almost open door policy, I think. And I'm just wondering, as a journalist, maybe this question is best directed to Martin, but moving forward, let's say there is a secret or some kind of piece of information that's gained by a journalist or whoever. Is there any kind of provision, or I guess how will you approach this? Is this kind of thing where you could take it to the appropriate, Madoguchi, or the appropriate person to ask within the bureaucracy and say, hey, I have this secret, I'd like to publish this article, is this okay? Or, it's funny that there's, until now, from everyone's presentations, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of provision to even check or a risk-free way to even consult with the government, with the bureaucracy about this. And yeah, I just think that's kind of strange, or I was curious as to how you'll handle that or what provisions there are. Thank you.
Well, I think first off, we're kind of a different industry than if you want to make something that fits a certain set of safety regulations, for example. The idea of going to the bureaucracy first to ask permission to write something is just something we're not going to do. It's just not going to happen. So, I mean, that runs against the grain of everything we do. That runs against the grain of what, the Constitution is about. I mean, it's a different thing. I think you're talking about something that's qualitatively different. It's kind of an apples and oranges comparison. I think in your case, these regulations are at least supposed to exist to ensure certain quality levels or safety or whatever. And in our case, I can't see any positive reason why I would ever talk to the bureaucracy to get permission to write anything. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So, I think this is an apples and oranges thing we're talking about, because, I'm not here to make money. I'm not trying to sell you. I guess I am trying to sell you a newspaper, but I'm not doing, I'm not writing the story to kind of make a profit margin or something. It's a different thing. I do what I do for public service. Frankly, I could go into the PR world and double my salary overnight. We don't do it for that. It's something different, and it's part of public discourse, and it's not just us. It could be bloggers, it could be academics, it could be think tank people. I mean, this affects essentially people who are trying to kind of get things out there and get information out there. And the idea that you go to the bureaucracy first, I mean, first off, they probably wouldn't talk to me because I'm not in the press club. Second off, if they did talk to me, if I told them, hey, I'm going to run this, they'd probably leak it to the press club to preempt me. So there is no Madoguchi, there is no sort of point of entry, because we're not really in an industry like that. I mean, if we have concern, for us, the concern that we bring to the bureaucracy is if I felt like we were under threat. Like, you may know that the Chinese government was hacking into my company's computers for a while, and we were talking to the Guy Musho, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, has an intelligence bureau. So when you have something like that, you'll talk to local people. But in terms of like permission to write something, it just doesn't. That's truly what Aso-san is talking about with Nazi Germany. I mean, you just don't do that. What I think twice about is getting someone in prison. Even if I can fall into this rather flimsy protection of the press, if the person I'm talking to doesn't, how can I quote him or her by name? I mean, that becomes like a really difficult issue, right? Because then how do you get information out there without putting somebody in jeopardy, right? And it's funny because I've faced this before. I used to work in China, right? And that's literally the environment we may face again. Like in China, you have to give people anonymity, which the Japanese press is pretty common, but we don't do it usually. Especially if it's something like this, where somebody's actually kind of telling you something that's really exclusive. But in China, we had to do it because people could end up in prison for talking to us, right? And that became reason enough to say, okay, I'm not going to quote this person by name, or even kind of let the officials know where this person may be found, right? You kind of try to cover up any sort of traces that will lead the authorities to that source. And I wonder if we're kind of in, and this is like, worst case scenarios, right, of course, but kind of if you take this logic to an extreme, that's the sort of environment where somebody tells you something and you have to be careful. It's like you use all your training from working in places like China or North Korea in Japan. And it just, that's, again, it kind of runs against the grain of what democracy is really, how the place is supposed to work, or at least how I think it's supposed to work. Not just me, I hope, but.
Yeah, so I think Martin's describing the position of the journalist, and we rely on journalists to get the story. And often government officials may not want to provide the story, or Martin or other journalists may uncover some very, very newsworthy, important information that the people ought to know, but it's been designated secret. And maybe he gets this information from a source, and maybe he wants to keep that source confidential. On one hand, of course, the source may have violated the law. It's a crime for that government official to release designated information. It can be a crime for the news reporter to persist in doing what we call investigative journalism, in pushing to get the information. In this article that was shown that I did on Japan Focus, I quoted a senior reporter for the Kyodo Tsushin, which is the major news wire service in Japan. And he published an essay where he said that this case, the story concerns the handover of Okinawa from the United States to Japan and the so-called secret agreements that were related to that, in particular related to the payment of money and related to American military vessels carrying nuclear weapons in and out of Japanese ports. And when the DPJ took power, they did an investigation. They released a lot of the information related to those secret agreements. The information was also released in the United States because it's in our national archive, and it's not confidential. It's available for anyone's perusal. But anyway, so he did some research by interviewing some retired Japanese government officials. And he got the story, and they said, yes, you know, we had this information all these years, and yeah, the Japanese government did pay this money, and yeah, we knew what the U.S. Military was doing, but you know, we kept it secret all these years. And he published a story about that. After he published a story, he got a phone call. I think that's where it starts. You get a phone call he said he got a phone call from a senior official. The senior official told him, you know, those retired officials that you interviewed, they have an obligation under the law to maintain the secrets of that confidential information. You broke the law by persuading them to release it. This fellow was not prosecuted, but he got the phone call. And maybe his boss got a phone call. And maybe there are a lot of those phone calls, and I don't know. No one knows anything. But, of course, this is what we describe as the chilling effect, where news organizations, particular senior managers, will be very hesitant to approve a publication of stories where they fear that there may be some threat. Senior officials may be offended. It may cause damage to access to other information in the future, and so on. So, you know, this particular law, as I said earlier, the biggest change from what we had before is ratcheting up the potential criminal penalty. I mean, up to 10 years for a government official and 5 years for news reporters and others.
Larry, Japan does have a law somewhat comparable to the Freedom of Information Act law in the United States that allows for public disclosure of government documents. How will this law, the new secrecy law, affect the availability of such documents?
Well, yes, Japan's law, national law, came into effect 2001. Like every Freedom of Information law, the general rule is that if anybody can request information from the Japanese government, Japanese or non-Japanese, the government must respond, but they may say no. And the law says there's some kinds of information that the government need not disclose. And of course, one of the most prominent categories concerns national defense. And the way the Japanese Freedom of Information law is written today, it provides very, very broad discretion in the government official, the head of the agency. It says something like, The information need not be disclosed when the head of the agency believes that it could cause serious damage to Japan's national security. So any information that may be designated as a secret under this new law will certainly come within that exemption. So Japan's Freedom of Information law will not help as a tool to uncover some of this newly designated secret information.
Go ahead, Steve's first, and if you could follow up after him.
Hi, I'm a Temple University student here, undergrad, Gary McCaskill. Professor says that he said that Abe's protection for the law is that is to protect Japan's national secrets, right? And that the alternation in power will keep these things in check. He also argues that there's a natural limit to laws. My question would be is basically that, did Japan have laws protect things like this before? If so, why go so far with this new law? What would be the reason for going so far with this new law? I'm getting like, usually in America we have laws that protect things, and we with new information, with new technology, we have to make new laws that are going to that's going to incorporate like we have an NSA. We're trying to find out laws to be able to make old laws better to incorporate the new technologies. So why this one? Has something happened in Japan of the selling of secrets? Has an Edward Snowden happened in Japan? And if so, what was it?
Well, I mean, you know, the existing rules to punish officials who divulge information that should not be, you know, made open. I think I'll ask Larry to fill that in. But the political context in which this bill kind of resurfaced or started to be reconsidered in the most immediate term, as I said, was it was to do with the United States government and Japan signing an agreement about sharing more information in the first place. So that was under the previous LDP government. And then the DPJ took over. And then, particularly at the time of the Khan government, in the DPJ, with the, you might remember the fishing vessel colliding into, the, National Maritime Safety Agency boat, and the video was then leaked by and made public, and so I don't think that really constitutes state secret, but that was actually one impetus that pushed our political leaders in the DPJ to think, okay, look, maybe something like that would be useful. So that was the background, and the discussions began, and Professor Hasebe that I mentioned, who was giving those arguments, in the public, was actually one of the experts on the panel of deliberation of the bill from the DPJ government time onwards, so this is how it kind of got a new life, but it's of course not anywhere near Snowden or anything like that. It's
Yeah, if I could just make a couple of comments. The first one on this idea of a natural limit. Professor Hasebe should look at the example of the United States. So everyone, every expert who studied the issue of secrecy in the US government concludes that we have this immense problem of overclassification. The US government publishes data. In recent years, we have more than 100 million classification actions every year. The information is either designated top secret or confidential. The lesson is that the thing just grows way out of control. And that's what's happened in the United States. And there's been a reaction since at least the 1970s to try to come up with some mechanism to force the declassification of information. There have been some efforts to do that. But the American experience is there is not a natural limitation. And then this issue of what's the particular need? And as Professor Nakano pointed out, we frequently heard mention of this, this video of the boats near the Senkaku Islands and how that was released. And of course, that information wasn't even designated as secret. And I think it's the kind of information we'd like to know about. I don't know what the grounds would be for the government maintaining that as a secret that the people shouldn't know about. But that's one of the cases that is cited as a justification in Japan. As Professor Nakano pointed out earlier, this is not a new issue. This has been around for at least 3 decades, going back to the 1980s, at least, when Nakasone was prime minister. Right-wing politicians were saying Japan is a haven for spies. Spy no tengoku desu. Yeah, exactly. And they were demanding that Japan must adopt some kind of law to stop these. What are they talking about? If they want to know about the paradise for spies, they should go to Washington, D.C. Did you ever hear the name Aldrich Ames? Aldrich Ames was a senior employee of the CIA who was providing information to the old Soviet Union and the Russians for over 10 years. He was caught, he would have gotten the death penalty, but the way these things work out is that he makes a deal and says, I'll cooperate and provide the information, and so instead he's got a life imprisonment judgment. Robert Hansen was an official in the FBI. If you look at the FBI website, they describe him as what they think may have been the most destructive spy in American history. They say that at least 10 human sources in Russia were executed because he sold that information to the Russians. We've had many spies in the United States throughout the Cold War. Japan's never experienced anything like that. The number one statement that's made by the opponents like the National Bar Association is, Japan doesn't need this law. There's an existing law, the National Government Employees Law, which requires national government employees to maintain confidentiality, maintain secrets. They can be punished with up to a year in jail. So, I mean, just a fundamental question is, was there actually any need for this law at all? And if not, what's the real reason that it was pushed?
Daniel Foote, University of Tokyo. I think it's on. Daniel Foote, University of Tokyo. A question for Larry. Since Kyle introduced you at the start, there hasn't been any mention of the judiciary or the Supreme Court. Do you see any prospects for lawsuits challenging this law? What sort of grounds would you imagine for those lawsuits? And do you see any prospects at all for any success on the judiciary front?
Great question, Dan. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time tonight to cover all the bases on that. But, as you know, when we get to this question of, well, with regard to journalists, what is improper activity? Martin here was pointing out, and you look at the law, and we've got this language, but it's very vague. And we get the question, well, is a blogger a journalist, and should he have some special right? And is the journalist engaged in a seito na gyomu, a proper act or improper act? If there is a prosecution under this law, then it goes to court. And of course, if you were in the position of counsel for the accused, you would look at the law and go, wow, this is really vague. So we're going to have to persuade the court that, in fact, the actions of my client were appropriate. And you'll look for precedent. And when we get to precedent, there's only one case. There's a Supreme Court of Japan decision from the 1970s. The defendant was a reporter for the Mainichi newspaper, which at that time was I believe was the biggest newspaper in Japan. And his name is Nishiyama. And Nishiyama obtained some information from an employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was related to the return of Okinawa to Japan. And it was a series of cables which concerned a payment of something like $5 million. We later learned that the US government received something on the order of $650 million in payments from Japan related to the return of Okinawa. But in those days, he was able to uncover that little bit, $5 million. And of course, his information proved the Japanese government was lying. The Japanese government said, the US is paying for all these expenses. In fact, Japan was taking on that burden. He was arrested. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs official, who was a woman, and they had a personal liaison, they were both arrested. She was found guilty of leaking the confidential information. He was found not guilty by the trial court, the district court, on the grounds that his actions are protected by the Constitution. Martin was pointing out some of the language in this statute which purports to protect journalists. The language in the statute is irrelevant. The Constitution says that freedom of the press is guaranteed. What it says in the statute is pretty much irrelevant. The activities of journalists are supposed to be protected by the Constitution. So, 1974, the Tokyo District Court said the actions of Mr. Nishiyama were protected by Article 21 of Japan's Constitution, not guilty. The government appealed. That was overturned, went to the Supreme Court of Japan. The Supreme Court of Japan said his actions were improper. In fact, in language that American lawyers would never agree to, I think this kind of use, that he violated the human rights of this government official.
Is that what was violated?
You know, I mean, we believe that human rights don't be violated by the government in the United States. But anyway, so the Supreme Court upheld the guilty verdict. He didn't have to go to jail. The sentence was suspended, but of course he lost his job and his career was destroyed. So that's the only precedent we have. So the biggest point is, if you get a phone call from a prosecutor or from a government official, and you're a reporter or an editor or an executive in a news organization, and that government official says, how did you get that information? And you say, I can't tell you. What do you mean you can't tell me? And what if the government official doesn't like the way you got that information? Or the prosecutor calls you in for questioning. The language is very vague, the risk is very great. The only precedent, the result is the Supreme Court says the reporter for the biggest newspaper in Japan is guilty.
Hi, my name is Tim Edwell. I'm a student here at Temple University. My question is for Professor Nakano. You were talking before about the motives of Prime Minister Abe in promulgating this law. And also you mentioned that this is the first time in post-war history that the LDP has had such a supermajority in the Diet. So it seems that seems to be sort of an idea that Abe is, very well-meaning about this issue, and just wants to protect Japan's defense, its ability to defend or protect secrets that are important to its defense. However, I think it's important to look at the larger picture of what Abe wants to do in his wanting to revise Article 9, revise Article 96 to revise the interpretation of the Constitution. Doesn't this make a lot more sense to look at it in the bigger picture of Abe's view of the government and sort of the right-wing view of wanting to sort of throw off the shackles of post-war Japan and sort of reassert itself on the international stage in terms of a country that is no longer sort of shackled to the peace constitution?
Yeah, what I meant to say is that Abe probably genuinely believes that he doesn't really mean to do much harm. So, he doesn't quite understand why people are so worked up and so, angry and concerned about this. There are also people who genuinely believe that this is separate from the kind of agenda that you talked about, the historical revisionism or, the revision of the Constitution. This is not that part of the story. And it's sort of a part of an ongoing debate about Abe's agenda, right? Because on the one hand, you have policymakers, you have academics who rally around Abe government and to try to seize this opportunity as the, what we often call the last chance of Japan. Japan has been sinking and, it's been overtaken by China, so, this is the last chance. And therefore you need to, do something. And so from their perspective, Abe being a strong leader, the LDP having a super majority in both houses, it's a great opportunity to what they often call, kimeru seiji, so decisive politics, that, too much time was wasted by indecisiveness and the drift. And so this is the time to get things done. And they also often make the claim that, what needs to be done is fairly obvious, and it's not, sort of a partisan or controversial issue. It's about, deregulation, it's about modernization of security arrangement and all that sort of thing, right? And so for those people who genuinely believe that this is all that is about, Abe is not really doing something particularly ominous with this one either, right? But of course, there are others who don't quite agree with that. And personally, I don't quite take the view that Abe is just, meaning well and he's here to modernize Japan, because of course he is also a revisionist in history, and in fact that's what he's generally, he genuinely believes in. He was elected to the Diet for the first time in 1993, and he built his career by denying, the sex slave system or the Nanjing massacre. He was, he rose in the ranks of the LDP by arguing for, stronger state intervention in history textbooks, in what they call correcting the way history is taught in Japan, and saying goodbye to the masochistic view of history and all that sort of thing. So that's really what his career is built on. So of course he has to watch what he says and what he does, but considering that, I think it's very difficult to think that this is not going to be, that this is a cause of concern. But the reason why I kind of try to put things in a bit more kind of nuanced thing is that we don't quite know when this law is going to be abused. We don't know, and that's the thing. And by the time we will know, it will be too late. But until that happens, the argument that nothing particularly wrong was done could become more and more convincing with the passage of the time, right? So it's very hard to counterattack in such a context because the abuses haven't happened yet, or at least we don't know them yet. And by the time we'll know, that will probably be too late. The chilling effect will come into place very, very quickly. So that's what I meant.
I'm David Hawley, a former journalist now teaching, and this is a question about why the U.S. government supported this law. And it's for whoever feels you might be able to answer it. I realize you may not be able to give a definitive answer, but anybody who's willing to guess, I'm interested in what your guess is. And as far as the defense security aspect goes, I think it's obvious that part of it is the U.S. government wanted to be able to share more secret intelligence concerning China's military with Japan, given the increase in tensions. But if we look at the whole tone of the conversation tonight, you would get the feeling that any Americans who care about American foreign policy and the health of democracy in Japan would be concerned about these various aspects of the law that concern is being expressed on, and especially Democratic Party type policy thinkers in the United States, or the kind of people that people thought Barack Obama was. And so the question that I have is, in your guess, do you think that Barack Obama just doesn't get it and he hasn't been well informed and doesn't have good advisors? Or is this the other Barack Obama who supports the NSA and, tough on journalists in Washington and drone strikes? Does Barack Obama understand what's going on and it's his policy decision to support this law? Or is he too busy with other things and he doesn't really get it? Anybody have a take on that?
Voice of the New York
I can't peer into the mind of Barack Obama, but my impression from dealing with his administration is that the security people run the show. I mean, I've never seen any indication otherwise. I mean, it's anybody who comes through, they're all pretty much, they could all have served on previous Republican administrations, and in fact, in many cases did. Yeah, the U.S. law isn't a whole lot better. You know, I mean, if you look at kind of what the U.S. and I think Larry actually has it written down there, so maybe you could talk about it. But you look at what we found out from Snowden. I mean, we have this horrible security state, this national security state. People in Japan ask me like, "Oh, do you have a nuclear village like we have that caused Fukushima?" I say, "Yeah, we call it the Pentagon. We call it the military-industrial complex. That's the closest thing we have. It's like the out-of-control, you know, bureaucrats and this whole nexus that kind of in Japan went out of control with the nuclear industry. And in the U.S., it's the military, and it's just you just that's the people. You know, that's really what you're talking about. So it's like I don't see the U.S. as being much of a check in this case because I don't think we do anything any better. And in fact, we're probably in a way, a dark future that I hope Japan recognizes and avoids following in our course. I don't know. Want to continue?
If you're interested in this question, the expert will be in Tokyo next week as a guest of, I think, the Sasakawa, or the Nippon Foundation, on, I think, Thursday, the 17th, from 5:30. Admiral Dennis Blair, who served as the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. The Director of National Intelligence sits atop all of the American intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, and many others, like 15 different agencies. The American system is big. But anyway, he has been quoted in the Japanese press as saying, before this law was passed, Japan's laws are too loose. Japan needs tighter secrecy laws. Now, I haven't heard his case as how he explains just why that is and what the solution is. I mean, the U.S. government, not only Admiral Blair, but many, many officials have pressured the Japanese government for years to upgrade the secrecy law because, I don't know why, well, because it's part of Pentagon policy. And in the United States, the U.S. Espionage Act is an extreme law which provides great power in the hands of government, which is why Edward Snowden is now in Russia hiding, because if he comes back to the United States, he will almost certainly go to jail for a very, very long time. The U.S. Espionage Act provides imprisonment of up to 10 years per violation. Another very vaguely worded statute, you know, the case of Bradley Manning, I think last August, he got a judgment of 35 years imprisonment. So, you know, the American government starts with the American model as the example, and this secrecy policy is intimately tied with global military policy. And I'm not an expert in this, but I believe American policy regarding Japan is really driven by the Pentagon.
Hello, my name is Alex Hassanin. I'm a student at Temple University. I wanted to know, what difference of effect will this have on foreign media versus Japanese media?
Stump from hell.
I don't know. Having just listened to Larry's description of what the Supreme Court of Japan might do to help me, I'm about ready to go back to China. Because the worst they're going to do is kick me out. I don't know. I mean, we're you know, do we even count as? I mean, if you look at the law, you see the words over and over again: foreign countries, international organizations. I mean, do we qualify as, if we report something or someone leaks information to us, are they leaking to a foreign government or to a foreign country? I mean, I don't know how it fits in, because it's obviously there's no precedent. We're going to uncharted territory, but you know, we don't have a lot of weight to throw around domestically. I mean, the big newspapers, NHK, these guys are really powerful domestic players. And we saw that in the creation of this law when they got this, these two provisions added. You could see their clout. You know, we don't have that kind of clout. I mean, it wasn't until the Hatayama government that we were even allowed to attend the Prime Minister's press conferences, for example. I mean, we're still not a member of many of the press clubs. I mean, we're just not, you know, we're kind of treated along with like freelancers and bloggers and, you know, all the other riffraff that's not part of the institutional, you know, the bureaucratic media here. So it's, you know, unless the US government were to intervene on our behalf, which they do in China, for example. Not always to great effect. We have, for example, 2 of my colleagues in China who can't get visas, despite the fact that it's gone to very high levels in the past with the Chinese. So that doesn't always work either. I mean, so I don't know. I would hope that they don't kind of throw that book at foreign journalists too much, because I can't imagine it'd be very good for Japan's image, you know. And having just finally gotten rid of Antarctic whaling, maybe they finally have a chance of improving that image a little bit, right? I don't know. I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's just too many questions that I don't, you know. And again, if Nishiyama could violate the human rights of his sources, I don't intend to do the same. But I mean, just in general, I mean, just, you know, it's not very heartening. I'm actually kind of alarmed by that Supreme Court precedent there. That really sort of scares me. You know, and the Abe government doesn't like the New York Times. So maybe they'll throw the book at us. I don't know. I don't know. It's uncharted territory. All I can say is, you know, we'll just plunge forward and see what happens. I'm not going to back off. And I used to get all sorts of the phone calls in China, you know. So I don't intimidate easily. But I don't know. We'll see what happens. If I'm in prison for 10 years, maybe I'll start squawking. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But that hasn't happened to me yet.
Hello, my name is Fabiola Tsugami. I'm a PhD candidate at Waseda University's GSABS. I went to the demonstration on December 6th and another one a few days later. And I interviewed people, I took pictures, and I wrote an article. I got a phone call too. And my question is, a lot of people were portraying Abe Shinzo as Adolf Hitler. A lot of people were carrying posters. And people were chanting, Nazisto quiero, right? So, Nazism, go away. And also the civil society, you know, representatives, they had no doubts why this law was introduced. They thought it was because of war that Abe is getting ready for. Second thing was Fukushima. We are 3 years after the catastrophe in Fukushima, and that's when the first cancers will probably be appearing. And they were trying to prevent that, you know, to hide the truth about Fukushima. What do you think about that? How legitimate is that?
Yeah, just to pick up the legal side of this, of course. And so the question is, can this power be abused? And what checks are in place to stop any kind of abuse of this power? And I think what we've been saying is, of course it can be abused. Government officials are human beings, driven by different agendas, depending on who they are. And then you ask, well, what mechanisms are in place to stop abuse? And the answer there is there isn't any. Martin earlier described some of the committees, councils that might be appointed, but they're purely advisory. There's no third-party independent body that will be created that will actually have authority to order the disclosure of information, for example, except a court. But the court is bound to follow the law, and the law really is on the side of secrecy. The court could look to the Constitution, and the primary complaint against the law is that it's an attack on popular sovereignty and access to information by the people and free speech. A court could theoretically find parts of this law illegal or action under the law illegal under the Constitution, but the chances of that are very close to zero. So from the legal side, it's obvious that there's tremendous authority granted to discretion, and it can be abused, and information related to Fukushima or related to the U.S. military bases in Okinawa or related to any other matter that an official may say, well, I think this disclosure would threaten national security, could be designated as a secret. And regarding Fukushima in particular, you may remember that when the Diet hearings were going forward, the Abe administration appointed a woman named Minister Mori to be the lead spokesperson on behalf of the government in the Diet debates. She had had no previous participation in the policy. Her ministerial post had nothing to do with any national security issues. She was an amateur. But apparently she looked good on TV, that's for sure. And with the question of Fukushima was raised, and she actually, I think she changed her. At one point she made the comment that, well, of course, information related to safety at nuclear power plants could be designated as a national secret, which makes sense to me, right? We don't want terrorists being able to get into the nuclear power plant and plant bombs or something, so certainly there will be some information that I think most of us would agree should be kept confidential and so on, but others, they're not. Anyway, the potential, there's very, very broad discretion with the government bureaucrats.
I might have chanted also that Abe is a fascist, so I'm trying to remember. But, there's actually an academic debate, of course, looking at, by the historians, whether, militarism of Japan was even a fascist regime, right? Because, we often talk about the Axis powers and, Italian fascism, German Nazism and Japanese militarism. And of course, the debate is whether, you can put Japan into the same category. And the big difference, of course, is that there was no, the militarist takeover of Japan was really not led by grassroots movements like the Nazi party or the fascist party, but it's really through the state bureaucratic system with the, existing elites turning in a different direction. So, the social dynamics of it is very, very different, right? And in that regard, I think you can pretty much say the same thing about Abe, right? Because he's not a leader of a popular movement. The LDP is the perpetual ruling party of Japan. In fact, he's from the Choshu domain. So, there you have it. It's really the traditional elites continuing on. But the point is, of course, that the post-war institutional checks on the government, have, gone through a meltdown, basically. So you don't have those checks that were instituted in various different forms. They are getting undermined one by one, and Abe is eyeing the very principle of constitutionalism today. So in that regard, I do consider him to be a fascist. But that's sort of, a liberal use of the term. It's not strictly speaking, what he even thinks he's doing, I think. But I think the actual effect of, what he's doing might be open to Japan turning into a very, very wrong direction in an unknown future. And so it's, it's very much of an urgent task for us to try to build back the bastions that protect our civil liberties and protect our democracy. But as I said, before, it's a very, very difficult road ahead of us, given the political situation.
I'm actually going to address the previous question. I was just thinking about this, I don't think the foreign press is the target of this. Because if we write something they don't like, all they got to say is that we're Han-Nichi, or anti-Japanese, and pretty much we're outside the pale. So it's pretty easy to kind of basically just disregard us, And I think the people who should be worried are Japanese journalists. This really is, I think, domestically focused. This is not meant to go after us. So I would say, really, if I were a Japanese journalist, and especially one that wasn't backed up by a big and powerful institution, that would be, I think, much more vulnerable. I don't, again, it's pretty easy to kind of basically marginalize us. We don't understand Japan, whatever. But that's what I mean. I remember when Woodruff, the Olympus guy, and the Nikkei Shimbun was saying he didn't get Japanese culture. And it's like, how can you not get $2 billion in hidden losses? Anyway, but that kind of, they can pretty much marginalize us just by saying we're anti-Japanese or we're just dumb foreigners or something. But I think really the 99% of the onus of this is going to fall on domestic journalists, particularly people like like Tachibana Takashi, the guy who broke the Lockheed or whatever, the whole Tanaka Kakue, Kimyaku, I can't remember which, there's so many scandals at that time, I can't remember all the, but that whole thing, like that kind of stuff, for Nishiyama-san, right? That the Mainichi Shimbun. Those are the guys who really, especially someone like Tachibana, because who's going to back that guy up? If they go after him, is the Bungei Shinju going to back him up? I don't think so. Who's going to support that guy? At least if you have like the Yomiuri behind you, you have something. But a lot of the good stuff in Japan is done by freelancers, done by magazine people. It's not done by the big papers. So the people who are doing the interesting stuff are the most vulnerable.
I'm Pauline Reich, I'm American lawyer. Oh, sorry.
I'm Pauline Reich. I'm an American lawyer and a professor at Waseda University School of Law. And I work mainly with cybercrime, cybersecurity, data privacy, data protection, all that good stuff. But I was thinking, and Larry, I'm going to ask you what you think. We've been talking about journalists a lot, but what about a chilling effect on academics and their publications? Because we publish too. I'm an associate member of the Foreign Correspondents Club too. That's one question. But I was thinking back, I was reflecting back on the book Cartels of the Mind by Ivan Hall. And I remember at the time, people didn't like that book, so it didn't get reviewed. And nobody talked about it. Okay, so there's a different Japanese way of dealing with things, which is to ignore people, shun them, and silence them, etc. So Larry, and both academics, what do you think, are academics going to be afraid to go out and interview government officials and to do their research on today's Japan or tomorrow's Japan? So that's one question. It's very subtle, and the new law, I heard Minister Mori speak at the press club, and what she kind of said was, we adopted the law and now we're going to adopt the rules and guidelines and details. Hey, wait a minute, so what can I do? What can I do? Etc. Okay, and as far as freedom of information, I tried to do a request. Now, I come from U.S. Department of Education, not from the military. But I worked with the Freedom of Information Act and Privacy Act for 16 and a half years in the United States. And we have some transparency. So if an American writes to the government and says, could you please give me the statistics on female professors in American universities, you can get that from our government. So I tried calling the Japanese government. Now, is this classified national secrets? I was denied the information twice. Okay, so my question is, we don't have transparency, we don't really have rights, and as far as rights, foreigners don't have human rights in this country because MacArthur and his team didn't think about us. They thought about Japanese people. That's my current view. Okay, anyway, your ideas.
Kyle, can we see my PowerPoint presentation? So anyway, I guess, Paul, thanks for the question, Paul. So I guess your main question concerns academics and researchers and other writers, and are they treated differently from news reporters? And if you read the Constitution itself, Article 21, it guarantees free speech and freedom of assembly. It guarantees freedom of the press. And so that raises the question of, do you enjoy freedom of the press or not? And
but Larry, there's something about academic freedom in Kempo.
there's also something about academic freedom in the Kempo. Oh, you had it. Look, this one, I think. Maybe the next one. Okay, yeah, here we are. So, as was mentioned earlier, as the law was being prepared, it was agreed, and it was set on the insistence of the Komeito, which is the coalition partner of the LDP, to insert some language that would show that the press would be respected and protected. And Martin earlier referred to this. This is the way I translated it. So the first one says, in the application of law, there shall be no interpretation that would lead to improper violation of fundamental human rights of the people. Right? Well, you said, you know, the Constitution is supposed to guarantee those rights anyway, but it says that. And then it says, and due care, and I forgot how you translate it somewhat differently.
High deal, right?
Yes, Haido, that's right. Consideration, due care, shall be shown for the freedom of news gathering. So I translate shuzai as news gathering, and the press, which contribute to the people's right to know. So it raises the question of, are you involved in news gathering? And if you're an academic doing academic research, probably they would say, no, you're probably not. But you might argue that you are, and but obviously you're not obviously protected there. If you're a blogger, you know, the same kind of issues arise. The next section says, to the extent that news gathering activities of persons engaged in the publishing or reporting industries. Well, if I'm a blogger, again, and I'm not making money off this. Am I involved in the publishing industry? Exclusively seek to serve the public interest. Well, who defines what the public interest is? Get that question. And do not violate the law. Do not violate the law. The freedom of the press is guaranteed by the Constitution. The Constitution is superior to the law. So I don't see the significance of this except potentially elevating laws, statutes passed by the Diet to be superior to the Constitution. Or employ extremely inappropriate means, etc. So this language is put into the statute itself. Does it have any practical meaning or effect? I don't think so. Because if I were representing someone who's faced with these issues, I would go to the Constitution. But clearly regarding the thinking behind it, there is one place that is occupied by persons recognized as members of the news industry. And then other people are not. And there appears to be a differential kind of treatment. But I mean, the earlier issues we talked about, the so-called chilling effect. You know, when you go and interview someone, and they say, I really don't want to talk about that. And you say, well, wait a minute, this is really important. You make your big pitch, and you get the guy to give you the information. And you write the story, and then you get in trouble. You know, we get this question of, were there any inappropriate means involved? Did you buy lunch for that person? Did you buy drinks? Did you do something else that might have been inappropriate? So you can't buy drinks for your sources, maybe. Was he speaking while he was under the influence of alcohol? I mean, all these questions come up about what's appropriate and not appropriate. And we don't have any answers, except for that one Supreme Court decision. So it's just, it's a very risky sort of problem.
One other group of scholars who also, I think, were quite active and early on in opposing the bill at that point were modern historians, you know, because they were concerned that the government would actually be encouraged to, you know, well, they can keep secret stuff to 60 years, so, you know, if there are things that they don't want ever to be known, you know, by historians, then, you know, like the return of Okinawa, how it really happened, then they can keep that secret for a long time. And in fact, perhaps even forever if they destroy the documents. So that's one thing. And I mean, I do wonder, because I don't do modern history myself, but I have done work on something like a bit more contemporary history. So, for example, I do and I've done research on Amakudari, you know, the so-called descent from heaven. So I have a book in Japanese that came out last year that was about tracing the bureaucrats from the former Ministry of Interior of the pre-war period, you know, who moved on to join the National Police Agency or the Ministry of, you know, Local Autonomy, you know, and their career path and where they went after they retired. And it's, I only worked with, publicly available sources. And, the bureaucrats of the old days like to brag about their career, so it wasn't too difficult, looking at the sources, who's Japan's version or internet sites, and you can trace where they went. And of course, among the better known, I think, interesting cases, of course, like the members of the germ warfare unit, 731, many of them went on to, lead, life as medical scholars, work for the Ministry of Health and Welfare, and went to establish Green Cross, and that company, of course, became very notorious and eventually disappeared because of the HIV contaminated blood scandal, right? And so I think these things really do constitute something we need to know. And so I also, in the book that I published, I include information about police agency bureaucrats retiring into SECOM and other security companies, which of course raise the question, if they are retiring in those companies, do they really want to keep their streets safe, or rather want to encourage business for their future employers? There's a conflict of interest there, right? And of course, there are questions to be raised about the nuclear power village, of course, but any other areas can possibly lead to attempts of exposing collusion, between the state and the business or civil society in other areas. Well, people from now on probably will have to be a bit more careful or wonder whether that's really not crossing a line. For now, I'm not worried, and I don't want to become the first case, but we will have to see, right? But these concerns, I think, are real.
This will have to be the last question. Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is John Helwig. I teach English at several universities here. And I have a question. As I understand it, this law is dealing with basically government officials giving information. But what happens when information is developed by the public and the government doesn't like it? Okay, I'm a volunteer for Safecast. Let's say that the worst thing happens and someplace else goes boom, and Safecast continues collecting data and all that, and the government says no, you can't post this information and all this good stuff because it countermands the information that we're putting out, or something like that. Or say like the fisheries agency. With the Arctic whaling thing, Sea Shepherd had video showing the ramming of the boat, and this was their information they generated, but it was embarrassing to the Japanese fisheries agency. What happens with that sort of thing under this law?
This is the rare example of an easy question.
There's no problem.
Yeah, so if you develop the information, and it's public information, under this law, the government,
no problem.
That's no problem. The official can only designate non-public information, as secret. So if you have it and you published it and you created it yourself, the government cannot use this law to do anything to you. Is there some other law?
Well, yeah, can they somehow try to shut down the free flow of this information because it's embarrassing to them?
What if they develop it simultaneously? Like, both ships have a video.
Well, if they develop it simultaneously and you can show that you developed it independently, then it's public information and cannot be made a secret. Of course, you have freedom of speech in Japan, guaranteed by Article 21 of the Constitution. And so the government has no authority to prohibit you from speaking, except in some cases. Right, so if you're going to do a demonstration, as we just saw last year, all those street demonstrations, the police say, well, yes, you can, but you can only walk in this one car lane, and when the traffic's red, you have to stop. And I was in one where, as we approached the Diet building, people are carrying all these signs, these placards. they all put them down and kept them, and I said, what are you doing? They said, the police told us we have to keep the placards down while we're walking in the diet area. And, you know, where's the Constitution? So it's hard to realize this, but I think in general, you have nothing to worry about. If the information you have is seriously embarrassing to the government, then you probably will think very carefully about it. But ordinarily, the freedom of speech is guaranteed.
Thank you very much. It was a terrific panel. The content was wonderful.